The moment I saw Karen standing beside two police officers on my lakefront dock, pointing dramatically at my property with that self-satisfied smirk, I knew this HOA Karen had called police to seize my lake property. What she didn't know was that I owned the entire waterfront, and her world was about to collapse. "There he is, officers," Karen announced, her voice dripping with false authority, as she gestured toward me like I was some common criminal. "This is the man who's been illegally occupying HOA property and refusing to comply with our regulations." My coffee mug nearly slipped from my hands as I stood on the deck of my lakefront home, watching this surreal scene unfold. Here was Karen Mitchell, the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood, HOA flanked by two uniformed officers, acting as if she owned the very ground I was standing on. The morning sun reflected off the lake behind them, creating an almost cinematic backdrop for what would become the most satisfying confrontation of my life. "Sir, we need to speak with you about some property violations," the taller officer called out, his tone professional but clearly influenced by Karen's theatrical presentation. "Ma'am here says you've been trespassing on HOA common areas and have refused multiple notices to vacate." Karen's eyes gleamed with triumph as she clutched a thick folder against her chest. "I have documentation of everything, officers. Months of violations, unauthorized structures, and complete disregard for our community rules. This man thinks he can just do whatever he wants because he lives here." The sheer audacity of this woman left me speechless for a moment. I'd been dealing with Karen's harassment for months, but calling the police? That was a new low, even for her. She stood there in her pristine white tennis outfit, perfectly coiffed hair, unmoved by the morning breeze, looking every inch the entitled suburban tyrant who'd finally played her trump card. "I can show you the exact violations," Karen continued, opening her folder with the efficiency of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Unauthorized dock extensions, illegal placement of recreational equipment, and complete refusal to acknowledge HOA authority over waterfront common areas." What struck me wasn't just her accusations, it was the absolute certainty in her voice. Karen genuinely believed she had me cornered, that she'd finally found the perfect weapon to remove what she saw as a thorn in her side. The woman who'd spent months trying to control every aspect of our neighborhood had escalated to involving law enforcement, and she was practically glowing with anticipation of her victory. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing there might be more to this story than Karen's passionate presentation suggested. "Sir, do you have documentation regarding your property boundaries and any permits for structures on your land?" "Oh, he'll claim it's all legal," Karen interjected before I could respond, waving her hand dismissively. "They always do. But I've done my research, officers. The HOA has clear jurisdiction over all waterfront areas in this community. No individual homeowner can claim exclusive access to lake frontage." That's when I felt something shift inside me. The months of Karen's petty tyranny, her constant complaints about my perfectly maintained property, her attempts to rally neighbors against me, it all crystallized into this moment. She'd made the fatal mistake of absolute certainty, of believing her own narrative so completely that she'd never bothered to verify the basic facts she was basing her crusade on. "Ma'am," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me, "I think there might be some confusion here." Karen's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "The only confusion is your refusal to accept reality. This lakefront belongs to the HOA, and you have no right to treat it as your private domain." The officers looked between us, clearly trying to assess the situation. What they couldn't see, yet what Karen had no idea she was about to discover, was that her months of research had led her to make the most spectacular miscalculation of her HOA career. I set my coffee mug down on the deck railing and walked toward them, each step bringing me closer to what would become Karen's most humiliating defeat. The morning was about to become very interesting indeed. To understand the magnitude of Karen's mistake, you need to know how this lakefront property became my sanctuary. 5 years ago, when my grandmother passed away at 93, she left me something I never expected, a piece of paradise that had been in our family for over 60 years. My grandmother had purchased this property in 1964, back when the area was nothing but farmland and a natural lake that developers hadn't yet discovered. She was a woman ahead of her time, working as a bank loan officer when most women couldn't even get credit cards without their husband's signature. She'd saved every penny, lived frugally, and when she found this untouched lakefront land, she saw something the sellers didn't: pure potential. One day, Tommy, she used to tell me during our summer visits, this will be worth more than gold. But it's not about the money, it's about having a place where your soul can breathe. She built a modest cabin first, then gradually expanded it into the beautiful lakefront home that Karen was now claiming belonged to the HOA. Every board, every stone in the pathway, every carefully planted tree held decades of my grandmother's dreams and sweat equity. This wasn't just property, it was legacy. When I inherited it, I was going through the worst period of my life. My marriage had ended in a brutal divorce, my corporate job had become a soul-crushing nightmare, and I was battling depression that made getting out of bed feel like climbing Mount Everest. The lakefront house became my lifeline, the place where I slowly pieced myself back together. I remember the first morning I woke up in my grandmother's bed, looking out at the lake through her bedroom window. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the sunrise like liquid gold, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than emptiness. This place saved me, literally and figuratively. Over the next 2 years, I poured my heart into restoring and improving the property. I rebuilt the dock that had weathered decades of storms, installed new decking that honored my grandmother's original design, and created a small outdoor kitchen where I could entertain the few friends brave enough to visit my hermit phase. Every improvement was done legally, with proper permits, environmental assessments, and more documentation than most commercial developments. I treated this property like the treasure it was because I understood its true value went far beyond market price. Then, the neighborhood changed. What had been a quiet community of longtime residents suddenly became attractive to developers. New houses sprouted up along the lake's perimeter, and with them came the inevitable HOA, Pinecrest Lake Community Association. They called themselves. At first, it seemed reasonable enough. Basic rules about noise, trash pickup schedules, architectural guidelines for new construction. I even supported the idea initially, thinking it would protect property values and maintain the area's natural beauty. That was before Karen Mitchell moved in. Karen arrived with her recently retired husband 2 years ago, purchasing a $1 million lakefront home 3 lots down from mine. From day one, she treated the HOA like her personal kingdom and herself as its unquestioned ruler. She volunteered for every committee, showed up at every meeting with color-coded binders, and within 6 months had maneuvered herself into the HOA president position. The woman was a master manipulator, I'll give her that. She'd smile sweetly while explaining why your mailbox was the wrong shade of blue, then follow up with threatening letters about community standards and enforcement actions. She had this way of making you feel like you were personally destroying neighborhood property values by existing. But she saved her special attention for me. Maybe it was because my property was the most valuable on the lake, with the longest frontage and the most desirable location. Maybe it was because I had the audacity to maintain my independence instead of kissing her ring like other neighbors had learned to do. Or maybe she simply couldn't stand that someone in her domain wasn't under her complete control. Whatever her motivation, Karen had made my life her personal project. Every month brought new complaints, new demands, new threats about violations that existed only in her imagination. She'd walk the shoreline with her measuring tape, looking for any excuse to cite me for something. The harassment escalated when she decided my dock was too extensive and my outdoor furniture was inappropriate for lakefront common areas. Never mind that my dock had existed decades before her HOA or that the furniture was on my own property. In Karen's world, she had the authority to regulate anything she could see from her kitchen window. This morning's police visit represented her nuclear option the moment she decided to stop playing games and simply have me removed from property she was convinced belonged to her HOA. What Karen didn't realize was that she just made the biggest mistake of her HOA dictatorship. And I was about to show her exactly how big that mistake was. The first time Karen decided to challenge my right to exist peacefully on my own property, I made the mistake of thinking she was reasonable. It was a Tuesday morning in March, about 4 months before the police incident, when I found her standing on my dock with a clipboard, and that expression I'd come to recognize the look of someone who'd appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner of neighborhood compliance. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached her from my back deck. "Can I help you with something?" Karen turned toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of expression politicians perfect when they're about to deliver bad news wrapped in false concern. "Oh, good morning. I'm Karen Mitchell, HOA President for Pinecrest Lake Community Association. I don't believe we've been properly introduced." She extended her hand in a gesture that seemed friendly enough, but there was something calculated about it, like she was already cataloging everything she could use against me later. "I'm just doing a routine inspection of our community waterfront areas to ensure everyone's in compliance with our guidelines." That should have been my first red flag, the casual way she said our community waterfront areas while standing on my private dock. But I was still operating under the assumption that reasonable people could have reasonable conversations. "I'm Tom Bradley," I replied, shaking her hand briefly, "and I think there might be some confusion. This dock is on my private property, not HOA common area." Karen's laugh had an edge to it that made my skin crawl. "Oh, I'm sure that's what you've been told, but HOA covenants are quite clear about waterfront regulations. All lakefront access falls under community jurisdiction to ensure fair usage for all residents." She flipped through several pages on her clipboard with the efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times. "I've done extensive research on this matter, Mr. Bradley. Individual homeowners cannot claim exclusive rights to lake frontage in a planned community like ours." Karen's expression shifted from fake friendliness to barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Bradley, I understand this might be difficult to accept, but when you chose to live in an HOA community, you agreed to abide by our rules and regulations. Previous ownership claims don't supersede current community standards." She pulled out a thick folder from her bag and opened it with theatrical precision. "I have copies of all relevant HOA documentation here. The community covenants clearly state that waterfront areas are common property, managed collectively for the benefit of all residents." What struck me wasn't just her wrong conclusions, it was how she'd clearly spent dozens of hours building this elaborate case against me. Karen had researched HOA laws, printed official-looking documents, and created what appeared to be a comprehensive legal argument. The problem was, she'd built her entire case on a fundamental misunderstanding of property law and my specific situation. "I'm afraid you'll need to remove these unauthorized structures," she continued, gesturing toward my perfectly legal dock and outdoor furniture. "The community cannot allow individual residents to treat common areas as their personal property." That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with someone who'd made an honest mistake. Karen's tone had shifted from neighborly concern to barely veiled threats. She wasn't here to clarify property boundaries or resolve confusion. She was here to establish dominance. "Mrs. Mitchell," I said, my patience beginning to wear thin, "I think we need to take a step back here. You're making some serious accusations based on information that doesn't apply to my property. Karen's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the mask slipped completely. Mr. Bradley, I've been managing HOA compliance for over 20 years across 3 different communities. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Your refusal to acknowledge community authority is exactly the kind of attitude that destroys neighborhood harmony. She closed her folder with a sharp snap and fixed me with a stare that was pure ice. I'm giving you 30 days to bring your property into compliance. That means removing unauthorized dock extensions, relocating personal items from common waterfront areas, and submitting proper applications for any future modifications. The sheer audacity of her ultimatum left me momentarily speechless. Here was a woman I'd never met before, standing on my private property, demanding I remove structures that had existed for decades, based on her completely incorrect understanding of property law. And if I don't comply with your requirements? I asked, curious to see how far she'd push this fantasy. Karen's smile returned, but this time it was pure predator. Then we'll be forced to pursue legal remedies. The HOA has significant authority to enforce community standards, Mr. Bradley. I'd strongly advise you not to test our resolve. She turned and walked off my dock with the confidence of someone who believed she'd just delivered a checkmate. What Karen didn't realize was that she'd just declared war on the wrong person. Over property she had no authority to regulate based on assumptions that were about to make her the laughingstock of the entire community. As I watched her march back toward her house, clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the cold fury of someone who'd been pushed too far by a bully who'd finally picked the wrong target. Karen Mitchell had just made her first critical error. Unfortunately for her, it wouldn't be her last. Over the following months, Karen's campaign against me escalated from amateur hour to full psychological warfare. What started as clipboard inspections evolved into a sophisticated harassment operation that would have impressed military strategists. The letters started arriving weekly. Official HOA letterhead, legal-sounding language, increasingly aggressive deadlines for compliance actions I had no legal obligation to take. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, packed with Karen's growing frustration at my refusal to bow to her imaginary authority. FINALNOT, I see Waterfront violation enforcement, read the subject line of her most recent masterpiece. Inside, she'd outdone herself with threats about community legal action, property liens, and forced remediation at owner expense. The woman had clearly been researching HOA enforcement procedures and apparently believed she could intimidate me into submission through sheer paperwork volume. But Karen's real genius lay in her ability to weaponize the neighbors. She organized community meetings at her house, where she'd present her case against my violations to anyone willing to listen. I learned about these gatherings from Jim Patterson, my next-door neighbor, who attended one out of curiosity and came back shaking his head. "Tom, you need to know what she's saying about you," Jim told me over our shared fence. "She's got charts, property maps, even printed photos of your dock. She's telling people you're some kind of squatter who's stealing community property." According to Jim, Karen had created an entire presentation complete with PowerPoint slides and legal references. She'd positioned herself as the brave defender of community rights, fighting against my illegal appropriation of waterfront common areas. The most disturbing part wasn't her lies. It was how convincing she made them sound to people who didn't know the real story. "She's got the Morrison family believing you're going to hurt their property values," Jim continued. "And the new couple in the blue house thinks you're some kind of entitled rich guy who thinks rules don't apply to him." Karen's propaganda campaign was working. Neighbors who'd been friendly before suddenly avoided eye contact during morning walks. My mailbox started getting accidentally knocked over by teenagers who'd never been a problem before. Someone even left a passive-aggressive note on my car windshield about community responsibility and respecting shared spaces. The psychological pressure was intense. Karen had turned my peaceful lakefront sanctuary into a fishbowl where every move was scrutinized, every improvement questioned, every moment of relaxation tainted by the knowledge that someone was watching, waiting for ammunition. Her masterstroke came when she somehow convinced the county building inspector to visit my property. I came home from work to find an official vehicle in my driveway and a clipboard-wielding bureaucrat measuring my dock with the same tape measure Karen had been using for months. Routine compliance check, the inspector explained when I approached. We received a complaint about unpermitted waterfront structures. I need to verify everything matches your approved plans. My heart sank as I realized Karen had escalated beyond HOA harassment into actual government involvement. She'd found a way to weaponize the regulatory system against me, forcing me to prove the legality of structures that had existed longer than she'd been alive. Fortunately, my grandmother's meticulous record-keeping saved me. Every permit, every approval, every environmental assessment was filed perfectly in her organized filing system. The inspector spent 3 hours reviewing documentation that proved every single structure on my property was completely legal and properly permitted. "Ma'am," he told Karen, when she appeared during his inspection, "these structures are all grandfathered and properly documented. There are no violations here." Karen's reaction was something to behold. Her face cycled through confusion, anger, and then a terrifying determination that told me the setback would only fuel her obsession further. "There has to be something," she insisted to the departing inspector. "Community waterfront areas cannot be privately owned. That's not how HOA regulations work." After he left, Karen turned to me with eyes that burned with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Mr. Bradley. I don't know what kind of connections you have or what strings you pulled, but I will not allow you to steal community property." The woman had become completely unhinged. Her crusade against me had evolved from neighborhood power trip into personal vendetta. She genuinely believed I was some kind of criminal mastermind who'd corrupted government officials to protect my illegal activities. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I'd spent months trying to be reasonable, hoping Karen would eventually realize her mistake and move on to tormenting someone else. But her escalation to government harassment had crossed a line that demanded decisive action. It was time to stop playing defense and start fighting back. Karen wanted a war over property ownership? She was about to get exactly what she'd been asking for, but the battlefield wasn't going to be what she expected. The next morning, I did something I should have done months earlier. I called my attorney. Not just any lawyer, but Sarah Chen, a property law specialist who'd handled my grandmother's estate and knew more about land ownership than Karen would learn in 10 lifetimes of HOA presidency. "Tom, I've been wondering when you'd call," Sarah said when I explained the situation. "I've heard rumors about some overzealous HOA president causing problems in your area. Let me guess, she thinks she has authority over your waterfront property." Sarah's laugh when I described Karen's claims was not reassuring for my tormentor's future prospects. Oh boy. Someone's been doing research without understanding what they're researching. "Tom, do you still have your grandmother's original property documents?" That afternoon, Sarah arrived at my house with a briefcase and the kind of focused intensity that made her one of the most successful property lawyers in the county. What happened next was like watching a master detective assemble clues that had been hiding in plain sight. "Your grandmother was incredibly smart," Sarah said, spreading documents across my dining room table. "Look at this original deed from 1964. She didn't just buy lakefront property, she bought what's called riparian rights to the entire waterfront area. She pulled out a survey map that looked like hieroglyphics to me, but clearly made perfect sense to her. See these boundary markers? Your property doesn't just include the land up to the water's edge. Your grandmother purchased exclusive rights to the lake bottom, extending 200 feet from shore, plus navigation easements that give you control over boat traffic in this entire section. My head started spinning as Sarah continued explaining the legal implications of documents I'd inherited but never fully understood. Tom, you don't just own your lakefront property. According to these deeds and the original lake development agreements, you own the water rights, the submerged land, and have legal authority over approximately 80% of the lake itself. What does that mean exactly? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect Karen's campaign had been even more misguided than I'd imagined. Sarah's grin was predatory. It means your HOA, Karen, has been harassing the person who legally owns the very lake she's been claiming belongs to the community. Every boat launch, every swimming area, every fishing spot she thinks is community property. You have legal authority over all of it. The irony was so perfect, it felt fictional. Karen had spent months researching HOA powers and community regulations, building an elaborate case about waterfront common areas, while completely missing the fundamental fact that there were no common waterfront areas to regulate. The entire lake belonged to me. But how is that possible? I asked. There are dozens of other lakefront properties. How can I own the lake? Sarah pulled out another thick folder that looked like it contained the history of the entire area. Your grandmother bought this land before any development occurred. The original property included the natural lake and surrounding acreage. When developers started building around the lake in the 1980s and 1990s, they purchased land rights, but not water rights. The lake itself remained with the original property yours. She showed me development agreements, easement contracts, and zoning documents that painted a clear picture. Every other property in the area had been carved out of larger parcels, with carefully negotiated access rights to use the lake for recreational purposes. But ownership of the actual waterway had never transferred. The best part, Sarah continued, is that all these other properties pay annual fees for their lake access privileges. The fees go into an escrow account managed by, let me check. Yes, the original property owner's estate. Tom, you've been receiving thousands of dollars every year in lake access fees and probably never realized what they were for. My mind flashed back to quarterly payments I'd been receiving from something called Pinecrest Lake Management Trust. I'd always assumed they were some kind of investment returns from my grandmother's financial planning, not payments from neighbors for the privilege of using my lake. Sarah, what exactly does this mean for Karen's harassment campaign? Sarah began organizing documents into neat piles. Tom, you have legal grounds for restraining orders, harassment charges, and civil suits that would make her wish she'd never heard of HOA regulations. But more importantly, you have the power to revoke the lake access agreements for any property owner who violates the terms of use. What do you recommend? I asked. Sarah's smile was absolutely wicked. I recommend we educate Mrs. Mitchell about property law in a way she'll never forget. Which brings us back to that perfect morning when Karen's supreme confidence collided with reality in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. As I walked toward the police officers and Karen on my dock, I carried with me a folder that would destroy every assumption she'd built her harassment campaign on. Officers, I said calmly, I believe Mrs. Mitchell may have provided you with some inaccurate information. Karen's laugh was sharp and triumphant. Here we go. More lies and excuses. Officers, this man has been trespassing on HOA common property for months and refuses to acknowledge our authority. The taller officer looked between us, clearly trying to navigate what appeared to be a neighborhood dispute that had gotten out of hand. Sir, do you have documentation showing your legal right to these waterfront areas? Actually, I do, I replied, opening my folder. But first, Mrs. Mitchell, I'm curious about something. You've spent months researching HOA regulations and community waterfront policies. Did you ever research the actual ownership of the lake itself? Karen's expression flickered with confusion before hardening back into certainty. The lake is community property, managed by the HOA for all residents. Individual homeowners cannot claim exclusive access to natural waterways. That's interesting, I said, pulling out the first document Sarah had prepared. Officer, this is the original property deed from 1964, showing the boundaries of my inherited property. The officer took the document and began reading. His eyebrows rose progressively higher as he absorbed the legal description. Ma'am, he said to Karen, according to this deed, this gentleman's property includes riparian rights to... It looks like most of the lake. Karen's confident expression began to crack. That's impossible. HOA communities don't work that way. There has to be some mistake. I pulled out the second document. This is a current property survey completed last week by a licensed surveyor. It confirms that my property boundaries extend 200 feet into the lake from the shoreline. The younger officer leaned over to read the survey. Sir, if this is accurate, then this dock and waterfront area are definitely on your private property. There's more, I continued, watching Karen's face grow progressively paler. This document shows the water rights ownership for the entire lake. According to county records, I hold exclusive ownership of the water body itself, plus the submerged land beneath it. Karen snatched the document from my hands, her eyes scanning frantically as the legal language destroyed her carefully constructed worldview. This can't be right. This can't be legal. You can't own an entire lake. Actually, Mrs. Mitchell, I can and I do. But here's the really interesting part. I pulled out the final document, the one that would deliver the knockout blow. This is the Lake Access Agreement that governs how other properties in this community are permitted to use my lake. The officer read over my shoulder as I explained. Every property in this neighborhood pays annual fees for the privilege of accessing the lake I own. The agreement specifically states that access can be revoked for any property owner who harasses the lake owner or interferes with his quiet enjoyment of the property. Karen's face had gone from pale to gray. She was reading the document with the expression of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. But the HOA, community property, common areas. There are no common waterfront areas, Mrs. Mitchell. There never were. Every square foot of this lake and the land beneath it belongs to me. The HOA has no jurisdiction over waterfront activities because the HOA doesn't own any waterfront property. The officers exchanged glances that said they'd clearly stumbled into something far more complex than a simple trespassing complaint. Ma'am, the taller officer said gently, it appears you may have been mistaken about the property ownership situation here. Karen's folder slipped from her hands, her carefully organized evidence scattering across my dock like her crumbling authority. You're lying. This is all fake. You can't just produce documents that give you ownership of an entire lake. Actually, I can, I said, pulling out my phone. Officer, if you'd like to verify these documents, you can call the county recorder's office. Sarah Chen, my property attorney, filed updated records yesterday confirming all boundaries and ownership rights. The younger officer was already on his radio, calling for verification. Within minutes, county records confirmed what my documents showed. I owned the lake, the water rights, and had legal authority over all waterfront activities in the area. Karen stood frozen on my dock, surrounded by her scattered papers, watching 2 decades of HOA power fantasies evaporate in the morning sun. The woman who'd spent months threatening me with legal action had just discovered she'd been harassing someone with the legal right to ban her from the water entirely. Mrs. Mitchell, I said quietly, I think you owe these officers an apology for wasting their time with false accusations." But Karen wasn't finished yet. Even facing complete defeat, she had one more card to play. "This is a conspiracy." Karen screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed accusingly at me, the officers, and apparently the entire universe. "You've bribed county officials? You've forged documents? No one person can own an entire lake." The officers looked at each other with the weary expression of professionals who'd seen every possible variety of human denial. The younger one stepped forward diplomatically. "Ma'am, we've verified these documents with county records. Everything appears to be legitimate and properly filed." Karen's response was to double down on crazy. She began gathering her scattered papers with frantic energy, muttering about lawyers, investigations, and exposing corruption. "I'm calling the state attorney general. I'm contacting local news. This kind of fraud cannot stand." As the police departed, shaking their heads at the morning's bizarre education in property law, Karen turned her fury directly on me. "You think you've won, but this is far from over. I'll expose what you've done. The community will know about your illegal land grab." True to her word, Karen's campaign of denial began immediately. Within hours, she'd sent emails to every neighbor she could reach, claiming the morning's events were evidence of a massive conspiracy. According to her new narrative, I was a criminal who'd somehow corrupted county officials and fabricated decades of property records. The community meeting she called for that evening was legendary. Jim Patterson later described it as watching someone have a complete psychological break in real time. Karen presented her evidence that the lake ownership documents were fraudulent, complete with printed screenshots from legal websites that she'd clearly misunderstood. No individual can own navigable waterways, she insisted to the confused crowd of neighbors. It's constitutionally impossible. Tom Bradley has committed fraud on a massive scale, and I have proof. Her proof consisted of generic articles about public waterways, none of which applied to private lakes on private property. But Karen's conviction was so absolute, her presentation so passionate, that several neighbors actually began questioning whether I might have somehow manipulated the legal system. That's when Karen made her fatal error. Rather than accepting defeat gracefully, she decided to escalate further by attempting to organize a community boycott of my illegal lake ownership. She printed flyers calling for residents to refuse to pay fraudulent lake access fees and to demand legal investigation of property fraud. The flyers were professionally designed, complete with bullet points about reclaiming community rights and standing up to corrupt property manipulation. Karen distributed them door to door, presenting herself as a brave whistleblower exposing a massive scandal. Unfortunately for Karen, her boycott campaign reached the attention of the Lake Access Management Trust, the legal entity that actually collected those fees she was telling people to stop paying. Within 48 hours, she received a cease and desist letter from the Trust's law firm, followed by a formal notice that her own lake access privileges were under review for breach of contract. But Karen's biggest mistake was contacting local news outlets with her fraud allegations. Channel 7's investigative reporter, Mike Rodriguez, actually showed up to interview her about the lake ownership scandal she'd promised to expose. I watched from my deck as Karen gave what she clearly believed would be her moment of vindication. Standing on the public boat launch, which, ironically, existed only through an easement I granted, she passionately explained how one man had stolen an entire lake through forged documents and government corruption. Mike Rodriguez's follow-up questions were devastating. When he asked to see the documents proving fraud, Karen could only offer printouts from legal websites about public waterways. When he asked for evidence of document forgery, she had only speculation. When he asked county officials to verify the records, they confirmed everything was legitimate and had been properly maintained for decades. The news segment that aired 3 days later was titled, "HOA President's Harassment Campaign backfires. It featured interviews with county officials explaining riparian rights, property lawyers discussing historic lake ownership, and neighbors describing months of Karen's harassment based on completely false premises. The final nail in Karen's credibility coffin came when the segment revealed that similar private lake ownership existed throughout the county and that such arrangements were not only legal but relatively common in areas developed around historic properties. Karen's response to the news coverage was to claim the media was also part of the conspiracy. She posted furious social media rants about corrupt journalists, bought officials, and cover-ups that would have made conspiracy theorists proud. But the community had finally seen through her facade. Neighbors who'd supported her harassment campaign began distancing themselves. The HOA board quietly asked for her resignation, and the Lake Access Management Trust formally revoked her family's lake privileges pending legal review of her breach of contract. Karen Mitchell, the woman who tried to have me arrested for trespassing on my own property, was now banned from the very lake she'd claimed to be defending from my illegal ownership. 6 months later, as I sit on my dock watching the sunrise paint golden reflections across my lake, the irony of Karen's crusade still amazes me. The woman who spent months researching HOA regulations and community property laws never bothered to research the most basic question: who actually owned what she was fighting to control? Karen and her family moved away 3 months after the news story aired. The social pressure from neighbors who realized they'd been manipulated, combined with the legal costs of fighting the Lake Access Trust's breach of contract suit, apparently made staying in the community too uncomfortable. Her house sold quickly, probably because lakefront properties with water access are incredibly desirable, something Karen never quite understood, despite all her research. The new HOA president, elected after Karen's resignation, was a retired teacher named Margaret Stevens, who understood that effective leadership meant solving problems, not creating them. Our first conversation was refreshingly simple. She apologized for the previous administration's harassment, confirmed that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my private property, and asked if there was anything the association could do to be a better neighbor. The transformation in community dynamics was remarkable. Without Karen's constant drama and manufactured conflicts, neighbors actually began talking to each other again. The artificial tensions she'd created through her harassment campaign evaporated, replaced by the kind of casual friendliness that makes living in a community pleasant rather than stressful. Jim Patterson later told me that Karen's departure felt like a collective exhale for the entire neighborhood. "It's amazing how much poison one person can inject into a community," he said. "We didn't even realize how toxic things had become until she was gone." The legal aftermath was swift and decisive. Sarah Chen filed harassment charges that resulted in a restraining order preventing Karen from any future contact with me or interference with my property. The Lake Access Trust's lawsuit was settled out of court, with Karen's family paying significant penalties for breach of contract and defamation. More importantly, the entire experience taught me something valuable about the nature of bullies and how they operate. Karen's power came not from actual authority, but from other people's reluctance to challenge her claims. She built her harassment campaign on the assumption that most people won't invest the time and energy needed to verify aggressive assertions, especially when they're delivered with apparent confidence and official-looking documentation. The moment someone actually examined the facts behind her claims, her entire facade collapsed. All those months of intimidation, threats, and community manipulation were built on a foundation of willful ignorance and unchecked assumptions. Karen had created a reality in her own mind, then spent tremendous energy trying to force the actual world to conform to her fantasy. But here's what really strikes me about the whole experience. Karen could have avoided this entire disaster with a simple trip to the county recorder's office. 30 minutes of actual research would have shown her that my property ownership was exactly what I claimed it was. Instead, she chose to spend months building elaborate theories based on generic HOA regulations that didn't apply to our specific situation. The lesson isn't just about property law or HOA overreach. It's about the danger of absolute certainty without actual knowledge. Karen's mistake wasn't ignorance. It was refusing to acknowledge that her assumptions might be wrong. She became so invested in her narrative that contradictory evidence couldn't penetrate her certainty. Today, my lakefront property is once again the peaceful sanctuary my grandmother intended it to be. I've made some improvements since Karen's departure: a new outdoor kitchen, expanded deck seating, even a small boat dock for guests. All properly permitted, of course, though I no longer need to worry about clipboard-carrying neighbors measuring my structures. The lake itself has returned to being what it always was, a place where families come to swim, fish, and create memories. The difference is that now everyone understands the actual legal structure that makes those activities possible. Respect for property rights, it turns out, creates better community relationships than manufactured outrage about imaginary violations. If you're dealing with your own HOA Karen, here's my advice. Document everything, know your legal rights, and don't let bullies exhaust you into submission through sheer persistence. Sometimes, the person screaming loudest about rules and regulations is the one who understands them least. And if you enjoyed watching Karen's epic downfall, make sure to subscribe for more stories about entitled neighbors getting exactly what they deserve. Because trust me, the world is full of people who need to learn that confidence without knowledge is just arrogance waiting to be humiliated.